From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm Anne McLean from the library's music division. Welcome to Jelly Roll Morton in Washington, a conversation with John Szwed, a Library of Congress jazz scholar, and Steve Winick from our American Folklife Center. John Szwed's residency at the library as a jazz scholar has been made possible through the generous support of the Reva and David Logan Foundation. And let me say that I hope you'll check out some of the other great jazz offerings we have this year in our programs that have been underwritten by the foundation. Professor Szwed is adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University and formerly professor of music and director of the Center for Jazz Studies there. He's also an emeritus professor at Yale. Among his critically acclaimed books, as you can see in the little program handout, is last year's Billie Holiday, The Musician and the Myth, and others that include a notable book on Jelly Roll Morton, Dr. Jazz, which won a Grammy Award. Steve Winick is a writer and editor at the library's American Folklife Center and holds MA and PhD degrees in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania. He's very kindly standing in this evening for the music division's jazz curator, Larry Applebaum. Steve is a most appropriate speaker tonight, not only in terms of his knowledge and background, but because the music division shares with the American Folklife Center a proud connection to Jelly Roll Morton's historic 1938 Library of Congress recording session here with Alan Lomax. That history is part of the lore of the library, and it's a glimpse of a seminal figure in our nation's cultural history. As you'll hear tonight, Lomax recorded Morton in long, fascinating conversations at the piano on our stage, a marathon, nearly month-long session where you can sometimes hear his foot gently tapping the floor of the Coolidge stage. So on display tonight, we have the box set of the elegant and comprehensive Rounder Records reissue of that recording session. And the Folklife has lent to us a crate, and I'll let Steve tell you a little bit about that. It has a history. And with these artifacts, we have several manuscripts in Morton's hand out on our table, so afterwards you can take a look. These are manuscripts drawn from the Music Division's Jelly Roll Morton collection. We have 127 copyright deposits of his music, including 9 holograph manuscripts and several printed scores. So you can see a couple of his penciled notes and their copyright authentications for a glimpse of Morton the businessman as well as the musician. So now let me turn this over to our two speakers. Please welcome John Szwed and Steve Winick.
Well, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
My clip is bending a little. There we go. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I will say that starting out and introducing me as coming from the Folklife Center and John as a jazz scholar is a wonderful and both true things to say, but it obscures a little bit of the connection that we have because John is also a folklorist, and we're very proud to claim him within the discipline. And when I trained at the University of Pennsylvania, it was in a department that was largely built on John's reputation among a few others because he had been a professor there. But he had moved on from that department by the time I got there. But he came back and taught as a visiting professor, and that's how I first met John about 25 years ago. I was a graduate student, and he was a professor there at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Folklore and Folklife. So John is, in addition to being one of the great jazz scholars and jazz biographers, really, if you read the books that he's written about Sun Ra and Miles Davis and Billie Holiday, just amazing work that John does in digging up these facts about people and also just their stories, the way in which they connect with us today and with the music, because he's a musician and musically literate too, and that just informs everything that he does. So, John has now dug up some interesting new stuff about Jelly Roll Morton in Washington, and it is kind of interesting that he was here for about 5 years, and very little is known about what he did here, except for the Library of Congress sessions, which everybody knows about. But apart from that, nobody hears much about Jelly Roll's time. So set the scene for us, John. Who was Jelly Roll Morton in 1935? What would people have known about him? Who would be looking for him?
Well, I was going to say, I suppose it's not surprising that you fade from fame, but it was 25 years. He came here 10 years after he had recordings that were turning up everywhere, including on soundtracks and things. Maybe, I don't know, do people disappear that fast? Maybe they do now. Maybe they disappear instantly after one recording or one appearance on television. But Morton, I was thinking, all the people I've written about had something in common. Either the facts of their lives were wrong, or they were so well hidden. I mean, you can't be more hidden than Sun Ra said he wasn't human.
Right.
And he would give you reasons, like quoting heavily from the Bible of all things. Man born of woman is, I don't need to get into that. But, or my favorite, you see, if you're born from the reproductive system, you're going to die. But if you're born in the creative system, whatever that added up to. So I found that fascinating, and also found it fascinating, what shall I say, a kind of laziness of writers who don't use libraries. When I was working with Billie Holiday, this is off the subject, but it's not, I think. Billie Holiday's original draft to her autobiography was just sitting there. And better than that, not better than that, but equally good, was the first woman to write about her, first person to write about her, and who, by the way, committed suicide downtown D.C., but that's another story. The entire text, 800 pages, was sitting in a library. Nobody ever looked at it. There was no...
Wow.
I mean, but I have the feeling every time in this library, I mean, sometimes I just wander around in copyright. I'm looking at Zora Neale Hurston. It was not surprising to see that she had written. Everybody had written John Henry. I think there were 190 copyrights.
Right.
But she'd written some minor hit songs. One called "Jelly, Look What You've Done to Me," which was a good seller in its time. I mean, I said, "Whoa! You could stay in the copyright office, just keep flipping those cards over."
And was she referring to Jelly Roll in that song, you think?
I think he's referring to syphilis, but
well, there you go.
Sorry to put it bluntly. But I understand that most of us have things about our lives that are not known by other people, and even if we had to have our families represent us after our passing, we would say, "Whoa, you asked the wrong people. You need somebody else." I understand that, but there are some kind of famous or almost famous people that you wonder why the distortions are so great and why they repeat themselves over and over again. I mean, when I first heard about Jelly Roll Morton as a young person was that he was an out-of-date, tired, figure that nobody would take seriously. And let's see, I think it was within 10 years of his death, I was thinking like that, something like that. And that he was a braggart, boaster, liar. So that was the end of the story. Duke Ellington, who had nothing bad to say about anybody, picked on Morton. But Morton had an answer for that, and he said that if you paid to have people say those things for you, it was okay. So it was more than okay. The more money you had to buy someone to say that you're wonderful, that was better yet. But if you say it, you're in trouble. Now, times have changed, and maybe it's okay now to say how wonderful you are and lie about yourself. I mean, I don't know.
No, but it is true that most musicians now have somebody whose job is to say how great they are, and you get this, if you're a reviewer or you're writing about it or you work in a library that puts on concerts, you'll get these blurbs from people saying, that are, outrageously inflated. And perhaps that was the kind of language that he was using, but it was par for the course in a sense.
But then when you see the interviews with his musicians much later, like Danny Barker from New Orleans, who played with him, he said, those Hart, Scheffner, and Marx clothes, those shoes, I forget what kind of shoes they were, that Cadillac, that Rolls Royce, those diamond rings, those dogs, these dogs wherever he went, they were real. He said, and he was what he said he was. He was a gentleman who happened to have a name that was slightly obscene, but, you know, the showbiz, and a very serious guy. So what struck me is I got past the idea that this music sounded like something from a cartoon from the 30s or 40s or whatever, that there was something really complicated going on in it, and I thought this guy's got to be more interesting than I thought, and I wondered how many times other people went through that same thing. Well, in D.C., that's exactly the way it went. He showed up, and I brought along things I picked up recently. Sorry that they're not in more graspable form, but this one, for example, before Lomax had ever heard of him, and I found only one person anywhere who seems to have mentioned him being here before this, but the Washington Daily News on 23rd of June, 1936, which he had just been coming to town, the headline actually reads, "Networks will air Senator Barkley's speech tonight at 9." And then it goes on with the rest. Well, it was the Republican convention was on, I think. And was Barkley a Republican? No. Yeah. So, yeah? So soon we forget it.
Right.
Anyway, down below here, let's see, a footnote. 1877, Vice President of the United States during the Harry S. Truman administration. I should read more closely. Anyway, the weird headline, and then there's a subhead. Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, one of the original hot bandsmen, invades Washington to start History of Jazz program over WOL next week. And then has a nice write-up, almost a modern write-up about his background and about the state of music at this time and what people in Washington would be listening to at this point. One of the old crowds in Washington now, in his late 50s, one-time king of the realm, really hot music. You might remember he's Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, one of the first to play Stomp, the first man ever to make a hot recording for Victor, one of the first of a lot of things when popular music is spoken of, and he's moved here from New York to live. And Friday afternoon, he walked into WOL and asked for an audition, but he didn't give his name. He just asked for a piano. A few bars in WOL said he was somebody. His name was asked and given, and now he has a show. So now if you want to know where your present swing came from, you can hear Jelly Roll regularly. He goes on tonight at 8:30 and will be heard every night this week at times governed by convention broadcast. Next week he starts a series, The History of Jazz, and it should make for good listening. So this is extraordinary. I mean, first of all, he walks in out of nowhere and he's a has-been.
Right.
They give him his own show, and nightly. And frankly, how many black stars or non-stars had their own show at the time? Just extraordinary.
Well, and it's also somewhat extraordinary that you found that now, given that a lot of research has been done on Jelly Roll and nobody's come across this fact before. You don't find this in writings about Jelly Roll that he had this radio show. So now one of the things you're interested in, you were just asking Matt Barton of the, the curator of recorded sound, whether maybe recordings of this show might exist. Yeah, so it's another thing to look for in the library.
It's true. I would doubt it, but because radio stations are notorious throwing stuff out, particularly a disc, which had been recorded on transcription disc, the big ones. But who knows? I mean, the other thing is that he was doing the history of jazz. Now, no one knew what jazz was. They don't know now because it's an undefinable phenomenon. It's in, there's chamber jazz, there's folk jazz, and so on. It's like everything else. But he was going to talk about this. This is exactly the way he approached Alan Lomax when he walked in. If I recall, the words were, "I'm Jelly Roll Morton. I'm the inventor of jazz, and they're stealing my music." And it was sort of absolutely true. I had a teacher who said, "What if you found a person who was a genius, but 25% of what they said about themselves was lies? Would you still consider him a genius?" I said, "Yeah, 75%. Why not?" Well, in his case, he could probably make that claim. For example, he copyrighted the first piece of music that's called jazz. That's getting close to being the first, and he was old enough to be back there, and he was better than one of the other. Why not? And but he also looked the part in some way. I mean, that was the interesting thing. When he arrived and parked in front of the library, which you could do in those days, and walked in, he was wearing a suit that from a distance looked really chic, but when you got close, it was raggedy. But he still had diamond rings on his hands. And so there was some kind of security,
sort
and some kind of
genteel poverty, or
And when he had more money in New Orleans and Chicago, when he was rather famous, he would make sure that when he arrived the week he was going to play, he would come and change suits. He'd walk around town and then go change his clothes and go back out in another suit. Well, if people don't notice you, after 5 or 6 times you go by in a couple hours and you have new clothes on all the time, they start to notice you. Wasn't it the guy who came by with the blue suit on?
Right.
And then he had these 3 dogs. And no musicians were traveling with dogs. He said, gentlemen always have dogs. I mean, why not?
But I mean, it all gets to something that we were talking about. Weirdly, we were talking about Irving Goffman, but it all gets to the presentation of self. I mean, he's making a character and presenting that character sometimes differently to different audiences. So you mentioned, for example, that in the interviews when he talks about his background, particularly in front of mostly white people, he tends to say, "My ancestors were French," but he also said to African American friends, "White people are stealing our music," right?
But actually, his ancestors spoke French, and it was Haitian French, but who's counting?
Right. Well, some of them were French, undoubtedly.
Well, he certainly was saying that he was a free person born from free people of color, and they were people who took a terrible beating in Reconstruction, and there was a lot to be dealt with there. People were they sort of displaced in a way in America, and historically displaced. So he's trying to pull that in. But it's true, he was sitting, and you could still see people saying, well, he was, I hate to get into it, but a show that won 6 Tonys, Jelly's Last Jam, is predicated on the idea that he hated himself and that he hated people of color. There's no evidence for that. I mean, it's just the opposite. Mm-hmm. And Baraka said, he called the band one night, said, white people are stealing our music and we've got to organize and so forth. I mean, I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Alan Lomax's perspective was not so much that he hated himself, but that he had kind of an inferiority complex, and that's why he said things that sounded like they were exaggerated. Yeah, whereas other people said that he was a terrible egotist, and that,
he
which were
built
kind
that
of
on
opposite.
one sentence, though. It was a sentence where he said that because I couldn't play certain things as a young man, I played new things to get around it. That could also be a statement about ingenuity and mother is the necessity of inventions. I got it backwards, right?
Yeah, right.
Maybe it works both ways.
Right.
Anyway.
But yeah, I mean, that is true. That I would take it more as you've suggested, that he was talking about his own ingenuity and how to get around certain technical things that he particularly wasn't good at.
But who would walk into the Library of Congress,
right,
and say, "I want to tell my story"?
Right, if they had an inferiority complex.
And he didn't know they were going to record him. Lomax didn't know. He had to go ask for special dispensation to get a pile of records and do it, and set aside time. That doesn't sound like an insecure person. It sounds to me like a person who's feeling like his stuff is being stolen. And what's critical here is that, how can I say this briefly? His best music was done in a time when popular music was more complicated than it was 12, 15 years later. Mm-hmm. That sounds odd. It's like counter-evolutionary, but it's true. The songs were longer and they were multi-parted, and they had scene-setting verses that set up a refrain. And these things were shrunk, and they were shrinking in the late 20s and particularly into the 30s. By the early 40s, they were completely gone. You didn't have to say why this song or why this particular setting, because it was just not necessary. So you could hear older New Orleans musicians saying of Louis Armstrong, who became a world-class figure, say, with all due respect, I don't think he could have played our music. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know whether it's true or not, but they're trying to say we had standards that they're not meeting anymore. They're doing something else. Well, that was part of it, but he held on to those standards, and he kept trying to do this stuff, these multi-parted pieces, these complex rhythm patterns that no one else was doing, and that it was too old to be said to be creative. It was said to be strange at best, and so on. And I think that was part of what was going on with that.
Do you want to? I mean, we had talked about playing a clip that shows him doing some stuff that most people could never do. Do you want to play that first?
Yeah, let's
selection?
do that. What it is it's a pre-electric recording, which is to say it's not going to have the good acoustics that they're going to have a couple of years later, as you'll hear in a second. And it's a piece called New Orleans Joys, which sometimes titled New Orleans Blues, which gets confusion because he also had a tune called that. And it's It's a 1923 recording, to be exact. He said that, first of all, he said jazz was not a thing. It's not a style of music per se. It was a methodology. It's not a word. He said it's what you do with it. It's what you bring to it, which is a pretty sophisticated point of view, I think. Mm-hmm. It gets you around the question, is that really something or other? And he had his own standards for that, and there were standards that were already dating in part. Some were, certain weren't. One of them was breaks. Breaks is when the rhythm section drops out for a bit and the music keeps going, and that was tuned to dancers who at those moments would do special things. You know, they'd spin out from each other, and it was like a free moment. And that still occurs in jazz, but not that much. Another thing was what he called the Spanish tinge. The Spanish tinge, this is the only place I'll disagree with him. I think it should be called the African tinge. It's an additive rhythm. How can I say this quickly and not make a fool of myself? Most Western music is even in the sense it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or waltz 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, or maybe you could do it 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but it's like that, and they repeat. In additive rhythm, you would have something like 3, 3, 2. No, that would be like this. Excuse me, my clamping chops are not up to standard here. Let's see. Slow it down. So it's 3, 3, hitting the first beat of the 3, and then the first beat of 2. So it has this kind of irregular feel, right? I used to play hand drums. I better not try that. Forget it. Now, this is akin in some way or other to tango, to the clave and Latin music, right, to lots of other things, but it's also basic to early rock and roll. And you can hear it in very strange places. People say, well, it's New Orleans, or it's coming from Mexico or something, but you can hear Jimmy Yancey was a blues player who was also a groundskeeper, I believe, for the Chicago Cubs. It could have been the White Sox. And he has this left hand that's playing this kind of tango thing, very slowly and languidly all the while with it. You can hear it in Bo Diddley's song, Bo Diddley. You can hear it in Chuck, Chuck, what's his name's, C.C. Ryder. Mm-hmm. You can hear it everywhere. It's basic to, There Goes My Baby by the Drifters. And, you know, I'm trying every period here.
Yeah,
There goes my
I mean,
baby.
the Bo Diddley beat is another version of the 3-3-3-2. So,
right.
Yeah.
So this Spanish tinge he thought was basic, and I think it was a way of breaking with ragtime. And ragtime had been the first music craze in America, and everyone was rag crazy. It was literally, I mean,
right.
There were massive hits. People were changing the clothing they wore to be able to dance and so on and so on. So he's trying to break with that, and he's calling those people corny, which he gets back in his face later on, right? He says, frankly, with the exception of Scott Joplin, who was he considered a more superior composer, he thought the rest were hacks. Mm-hmm. And he would even record their tunes to show that they weren't good.
Yeah, so and of course, you're right. When scholars have studied that kind of rhythm, they find that it's associated with Latin music in the U.S., through Cuban music a lot of the time, but of course it would have come through Haitian music as well, and it is probably African in origin rather than Spanish, but he probably just thought of Spanish because that was one of the communities that was playing it.
And it's found in the Caribbean in virtually
right.
every area, and so forth. It's what he's doing is historicizing popular music, and that's still not been done well. Right. I mean, he's sort of saying this is not just popping up out of the air. It's not, you know, these aren't pop-up stores. This is coming from a matrix of some sort, you know, maybe held by church people who had the same thing. I mean, you can hear that beat in
right.
some church groups and so on.
So do we want to hear New Orleans Joys and let them?
Yes, I say there's one. What I want you to hear is the Latin thing of the left hand, which you'll recognize immediately. But about 2/3 of the way through, his right hand appears to go out of phase with his left. And for critics for years coming on this said he got lost. Well, the problem with that is his left hand is perfectly right all the way. How could he be lost in only one hand? And the fact is, when he reaches the end of the 8 bars, he's back on the beat perfectly. This is so difficult to do, he didn't do it the next time he recorded it. And people who do it kind of fake it now, or they don't do it at all. But you'll hear very clearly that he's laying one rhythm on top of another, 2-tiered rhythm, which, if I dare to say this without knowing it's true, Charles Ives, about the same time, was doing the same thing, one of his colleagues. Let's try that. Yeah.
So it's like being a drummer, but also playing the melody at the same time, in a way, because drummers have hand independence in their rhythm sometimes.
Yes, I'm thinking about that. How many play 3 against 4? I guess they can do it, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Notice, by the way, that rap music is very primitive in its rhythm structure. Louis Armstrong was doing much more complicated things in 1924. I say that to rappers, and they say, that's corny. I said, do it. I mean, sing 3 over 4.
Right.
You know, and don't mess up.
Yeah, right. So we're going to hear it.
You already hear the Latin thing. Transcribe it, and he said, frankly, I don't have the skills to do it.
Let alone play it. But, the other thing is it kind of shows why he would have this frustration about the level of skill and the perception of him, because he's a guy who recorded something that's so difficult to do that the natural assumption of people hearing it was he didn't know what he was doing. It was a mistake, and that's got to be frustrating.
Well, let's try one more, the Black Bottom Stomp from 1926, which is often brought out to be examples of his orchestral stomp. He had a very orchestral approach to the piano. You could hear a little flute thing going at one point, your tubas and so on. This is less than 3 minutes long. It has 2 parts, and it has, if we get variations, about 3 or 4 variations of the first part, and 2, and so there are 4 total, I suppose, and the last one is a much longer one. And you'll hear the Spanish tinge again, and sometimes, by the way, there are other names for the Spanish tinge in its variations. One is the Charleston.
Yeah.
Well, you have to have a fixed beat to hear it against. You'll hear it in that, let's see, what else? The pango bass, and at the time, I think it was the slow drag, the best I can tell from historical things. You can see a hip movement in that last one, right? That the discordant repeating, that's almost a hip going to the left on the thing. So you'll hear that, but it'll be coming very fast. The first part's in B flat, and there's really something cool about this because it's 90-some bars, and you don't hear a B flat chord anywhere in it till right at the end. And that produces a floating, cloudy quality. And then suddenly he comes crashing into the next part, which is an E flat, if I've got my memories right on this, and he introduces new material. The first time you hear them play together, the material is written out for them. And most of the rest isn't, except there's strong hints that the trumpet player's part was, the improvisation was written. Mm-hmm. That's completely believable at that point. What else should I say? There's a modulating interlude that changes keys. There's some collective improvisation, which is classic New Orleans stuff, and they're all improvising at the same time, and yet they're not making mistakes in this. And then what's really interesting to me is that there are 6 recombinations of instruments in this. That is 6 things that are totally different: banjo and drums, trumpet and something, and so on. And there are only 7 musicians, so he's used 6 of the 7, always in a different way. What else? At the point near the end, where you would expect it to what they used to call taking it home or taking it out. They get loud, very heavily rhythmic, and go steaming out. Instead, he drops the volume, and everyone gets soft, mm-hmm. which is, I'm going to guess he got from Latin type stuff where there was a lot of that going on. And then he goes to the out part where the drummer goes to a backbeat, like rock and roll, the 2 and the 4, which he hasn't been doing. There are other interesting things. The bass player is sometimes playing in 2-beat and 4-beat. That is a 1, 2, 1, 2, and they'll switch 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. This is an RCA recording, which is particularly good. And Danny Barker said it's because Jelly did what no white person would do. He went behind the glass, mm-hmm. with the sacred shield just supposed to be. He said, the bass sounds awful. And it did. So his bass parts sound way better than other people's. They sound almost modern. Now, it's not modern sensibility. It's going to sound old, but the complexity of this thing is just dazzling. So less than 3 minutes piece. It's got 2 themes, 6 different instrument combinations. What else should I say? 4 varieties of rhythm: 2-beat, 4-beat, Charleston's or Spanish, and break. And the bass player is alternating. That's a lot for 2 and some minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe we should get back to D.C.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah. So, what were the circumstances? I mean, how did he end up here, in your understanding?
Well, he said he got into boxing promoting, and that sounded strange to me. Except recently, someone found Pennsylvania. No, it was the Pittsburgh Courier had an article on him staging an automobile race in Washington, Pennsylvania, a 100-mile race. And the promoters were Jack Johnson, the heavyweight champion of the world, and that made perfect sense to me because Johnson was also a bass player and had his own band. And after he quit boxing, he toured like that. A lot of boxers did in those days. They were tap dancers or something or other. He did musical careers. So he had this promotion background already, and he said he was going to try to do boxing here. That didn't work out, and tried several other things. One was what he called the Interracial Theater Company. And he had in mind getting more people of color in films, but he thought the way to do it was to show how both races, as it were, as they talked in those days, could be in the same film. Unfortunately, he used one of the better theaters. Was there a Lincoln Theater? Yeah, he used the Lincoln Theater for auditions, and almost nobody came to him. So whatever happened, that fell apart. So he kept trying those various things, but meanwhile he had come to town, not exactly to, but it sort of shortly after being here, he became the co-owner or the co-something or other of a restaurant at 1211 U Street, upstairs over a hamburger stand, which is now Ben's
Jelly Bowl, yeah.
So I don't know if he's selling Jelly Roll or not. But,
right.
Probably not. One of the people who met him was a record collector. No, this is Roy Carew, a name I should mention. Roy Carew was, I believe, from Michigan, and he had gone to New Orleans to take a job and had run across ragtime and so on. He was a good pianist. He got to know Morton a bit and actually wrote some songs with Morton. He was working in the Treasury Department here, and he heard about him, and he went to see him after he heard that he was there. And I just found this recently. He handed him a piece of lyric, not music, that was talking about him coming to the district. Got a letter from a friend called Young. From his letter, I got terribly stung. He said, come to Washington, D.C. to manage a club for a woman, do-re-mi. Wait a minute, I've got to read the lines right. To manage a club for a woman, do-re-mi, and said, take the next train and leave. It was cold as hell, and then I freeze. He met me at the train in the snow and ice and rain. He said to me, I know she'll be pleased. We went to the place, and the oil stove hit me in the face. Well, they only had one oil stove in the middle, and you get chilblains or something. So people were always hanging around that I think. So, to make a long story short about this, he wasn't exactly drawing big crowds. There were people who came in for one reason or another that were not necessarily interested in the music, and they would rent it out to other groups and so on, and he would be surly about the fact that these were young whippersnappers and the like. But let me give you an example of some of the people that came in there. This Charles Edward Smith, who wrote the first real book about jazz, although he doesn't mention Jelly, which is really odd.
That's
he goes
weird,
to see him and doesn't mention. He said, without being conscious of it, that small group of Washington jazz fans who encouraged Jelly helped him immeasurably to resume his title and place. I don't know what I'd do if a few friends didn't drop in. He said, people don't know the old jazz anymore. So it was good to talk anytime and say flatteringly, your friend really knows. Say, listen to him talk about Buddy Bolden. Then Jelly would go back to the piano again. I recall evenings with mixed groups that were permissible in some places in Washington. A bunch of us gathered about the spinet piano, and Jelly tossing off blues verses and goading Sterling Brown of Howard University into singing a few. Now, I knew Sterling, and some of you may have known him. He was fired from Howard for doing this kind of thing and teaching it in class, using Bessie Smith as his example of poetry. And I asked him one day, I said, I keep hearing these stories that you were fired. It sounds like you were fired again and again. I was fired and rehired, and then fired and rehired, and then fired and rehired, and then retired. So he got fired 3 times. And if you hear people like Mary Baraka, the late Mary Baraka, and who else was it? A.B. Spellman, who would tell you about going to his house, this huge recording collection. And Baraka said to me, when I saw those records and the way they were grouped by styles, I realized that this was like literature. I could, you could be a scholar of this stuff. You just didn't listen to it that way. So I remember Jelly telling a crowded, fidgety union benefit audience, most of whom wanted to dance, that he would enlighten them with a resume of jazz history, beginning with Buddy Bolden. Many members of the exclusive Jelly Roll Club, such as Neshwe Erdogan, I knew them only by hearsay. Jelly was increasingly proud of his fans, and one day at the Howard Theater, I corralled Sidney Bechet, and we went up to the creaking stairs. Sidney Bechet was the second most important New Orleans musician after Armstrong, and Jelly's wife happened to be in the place, and the effusive greetings in Creole put New Orleans on the map all over again. The Erdogan brothers were, you probably know better than me, were sons of the Turkish ambassador, and they put on concerts in the embassy, and had that money to do it, but they were there, and both of them became very big in the recording industry. They built Atlantic Records, and Ray Charles was signed and all that stuff, so that was that. And Charles Smith, who I mentioned, let's see, Alistair Cooke.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little about him. Yeah.
BBC, he was a piano player. Somebody he used to be on PBS a lot. He passed away a while back.
Yeah, he used to be the host of Masterpiece Theater, so he'd be sitting in a chair like us, and he'd introduce the shows.
He looked the part.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that
he was a bon vivant.
That he was known here in the U.S. as an interpreter of British culture for Americans, but he was known in Britain as an interpreter of American culture for English people, because he had a radio show called Letter from America, which was one of the longest running radio shows in the world. And so there are innumerable hours of his voice talking about American culture in Britain. And he had a connection to the Library of Congress. He has two interesting connections to the library, one of which is that we happen to have, through almost a coincidence, the first recording of his voice that was ever made, because he came here as a graduate student, and one of his professors, Miles Hanley, was doing a survey of dialects. And he was a linguist, and he was part of the American Dialect Society, and he recorded all kinds of people, but one of the people he recorded was Alistair Cooke, just talking about his interest in drama and that kind of thing. So that's an interesting connection. That was in maybe 33, 34. And then in 1938, this was sort of in the same era when he met Jelly and when he met Alan Lomax. He became really interested in American folk music, and he decided he wanted to do a program on the BBC of American folk music, and he put together this proposal and wrote this very eloquent letter to Herbert Putnam, the Librarian of Congress at that time, who allowed him to duplicate records from the Library of Congress. And so he's one of the first people actually to use Library of Congress field recordings that were made by the Lomaxes and others on the radio. And this was a very extensive show, and the deal was, that's spelled out in the correspondence, that the show would only be played once live, so it wouldn't be recorded, so that there wouldn't be any rights issues with the music becoming part of the BBC archives or anything. So as far as we know, it never was recorded, and it's lost to history. But we know that it happened, and it was called "I Hear America Singing," and it was one of the first times that traditional American folk music, including African-American folk music, was heard on the airwaves in Europe. So Cooke was this kind of figure, and he had a sort of role in mediating Jelly's relationship with Alan Lomax as well.
And then Lomax trying to escape the purge of folkniks by the McCarthy people.
Right.
Went and got a job at the BBC, was playing the same records.
Exactly.
Presumably he left them there. I don't know. They got him back one way or the other.
Yeah.
So he said...
So how did Cooke
Well, he said he wanted
Jelly
to go
story?
in and find out how to play better blues piano, and the quote I've got is, he said, "If you want to play the blues, boy, take it easy." He goes slower. Just chords and cut out that picture show right hand, which I take it was too elaborate. Cooke said it was like meeting the president in a shoe shine stand.
Right.
Well, I called Cooke when I was working on the box set of the Morton stuff, and left a message. And then the message came back when I wasn't there. It said, "I'll talk to you about it happily, but you better call. I'm dying." So I'm trying, would he be joking? He died that day. So, yeah. But the idea that he was going to call me back, I mean,
Yeah.
man,
Yeah.
man about town or whatever,
Well,
you know. I mean,
yeah. When I was researching his recordings in the library, I talked to his son, John Byrne Cooke, who was a bluegrass musician among other things, but also a scholar, and he's since passed away. So that's another sad coda to the Alistair Cooke story. But so he helped mediate between Jelly and Lomax in a way.
Yeah. Well, another person coming to it was more obscure but important, William Russell, who recorded interviews and massive amounts of recordings in New Orleans in the last days of its founders. It was that kind of music. And he was in D.C. as a percussionist with the Red Gate Shadow Players, which I don't know much about except it was Chinese theater. Has anyone ever heard of them? It was kind of experimental Chinese theater, and he was a drummer or a percussion of sorts.
We have a Chinese theater expert that we will introduce you to at some time, so you can talk about that.
Well, he did. This book is very hard to find, the Jelly Roll Morton scrapbook, which is about this big and big, thick thing, and putting all the pieces together. So we talked about the Erdogan's. Murray Kempton, one of the top journalists we've ever produced in America, was editor of the Johns Hopkins student newspaper at that point, and he was there again. William Gottlieb, who was working for the Washington Post as a reporter, but was beginning to take pictures.
Right.
And his pictures, I can use the word iconic with a straight face, as the pictures who are here in the library, some of the greatest pictures ever taken of anybody.
Yeah.
You've all seen them, even if you don't know that.
And if you don't go onto loc.gov and look for Gottlieb photographs, and then you'll see them there. I always thought he was like the Ansel Adams of nightclubs. Smoke will go up and look like it's been painted. You know? Yeah.
It'd be white on white and black on black. And I asked him about it, and he said it meant you had to sit for hours and keep coming back to let you sit near the musicians, and then maybe you could get these pictures right. So those people were all in there, and they all had some kind of way in which they were trying to promote it. I'll go to one more person who, you may have heard this quote, but I'll give you a little more of the background. Billy Taylor, who had a long relationship with the district, because he, I shouldn't say the district, that's what they used to call the prostitution area of New Orleans, the district. Taylor said this. He said that he was part of what he thought was the best young piano players in Washington. And he said they weren't just playing the obvious things. He said they were studying Bartok and Schoenberg and Webern and Hindemith. And by the way, the beboppers were too. So this is in New York. I found in my own researches upstairs where Charlie Parker sees Hindemith and says, at the concert, and said, he's using the same harmonies we are, and they say we're playing out of tune. And then he says, we got to meet him. He's our ally. Right. By the way, what he was going to see, Parker was going to see Fantasia day and night over and over again. The weird connections here. So anyway, Taylor considers himself one of the anointed of the young musicians in Washington. And a group of them heard about this, and the guy was claiming to be great. So one Saturday night, they all decided to go see him. And he said, we were some young hipsters who had stopped in to have some fun with him. And then he came in, and he looked shockingly sick and feeble, old and a little mad. But he wore his old Southern gentleman suit with dignity, and when he smiled, the diamond in his tooth still glittered. He played a new piece of his called Sweet Substitute. And then, since the grapevine grows quick in little places like this, he looked straight at us. His eyes had a very personal kind of pride which I'd never seen before. His look had the strangely arrogant wisdom of those who know, those who've been there and seen it, and at the end realized that nothing very shattering has happened after all, because dying is a slow and shabby business. Who could believe that Billy Taylor could be this kind of writer? Then Jelly spoke to us. You punks can't play this. I forget the tune. What I do remember is a big, full, two-handed piano player, a ragtimer modified and relaxed by New Orleans and very swinging. I suppose the tune was corny, now that I look back on it, but it had its own charm. There was something extremely personal about which defied description. And as I listened suddenly, I knew, he's right. I can't play it. just purely technically, I can't play two hands together and separately the way he does. I looked over at the other confident young men who'd come in with me, and I saw they knew that they couldn't either, and ours was a very quiet booth for the next three hours.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is it confirms exactly what you were talking about in New Orleans Joys, too, that, you know, people who really play can tell what's going on there, and it's, you know, listeners who maybe aren't quite so familiar with the mechanics of the hands that that it sounds like you got lost there for them. Yeah.
Something I just picked up is, I don't know much more about it than what I'm going to tell you is, of course, I can't tell you what I don't know. There was a band in town in 1937 at least that went under several names, and the only one I recall is, did I make a note of it? It was just Andy Howard's Collegians. And they played for big dances. They played, was there Coconut Grove here? A dance hall? Seemed a Coconut something? At any rate, they would rehearse after, this is not uncommon, rehearse at 3 to 5 in the morning after playing the other stuff. So they noticed this guy sitting in the back after people had left. And somebody wanted to ask him what he was there for, and he said he liked their music. And they chatted, and they told him who it was, and he said, I brought something I wrote for you. He said, and long and short of it is we couldn't play it. He said it was simultaneously very old and very progressive and wild. So if he may have been trying to make a jump into the swinger, I should have said earlier that why he was so bitter was his songs were being turned into hits, and he wasn't getting any payment for them. Partly because being black, he couldn't get into ASCAP, and BMI didn't exist at that time. And W.C. Handy managed to get in, which is a wonder. And there's a story.
Well,
Jelly set out to destroy W.C. Handy.
Yeah, let's talk about the Handy spat.
Yeah, Handy was on a program called Ripley's Believe It or Not, the man who invented jazz. And I thought for a long time that he was there and interrupted the broadcast, but that was just wishful thinking. He started writing letters to newspapers, the Baltimore, whatever it was at the time, and watched the paper and said, the man's a liar, and he wouldn't recognize the music. He can't even play it, and so on. And then I mean, Handy was something of a god. I mean, one of the first paperback books that was distributed to soldiers to take in Europe was his book, and so on. So here comes this guy saying this thing, and Handy said, I wouldn't play that music if I could. You know, that's not proper music. They went back and forth, and they said, got into trade papers and big papers and what have you. This is leading up to him.
That in itself is a kind of admission, though, isn't it? I wouldn't play it if I could.
So he's trying this stuff, and lest I forget it, he came up with a plan which he sent to Roosevelt. His own, he was going to create his own NEA or his own WPA or something, and the project was pretty straightforward. I know these guys in Baltimore, and I'll organize them into a band, and I'll teach them this stuff, and we'll write a book of music for them, and then we'll split the band in two, and they'll get more people, and then they'll split the. It sounds like a Ponzi scheme or something. Right. But it wasn't a bad employment idea. You know, you educate people, and they're going to get money out of it because they'll get to be playing. He never heard back from
right.
FDR.
In 8 generations, every musician in the world will be in your band, right?
That's right. So Lomax's description, I also have Lomax's sister's description since she met him at the door. He drove up in this I guess he was in the Cadillac at that point, a big long one. And she said he was beyond graceful. He was, what's the word she used? Not gentlemanly. Courtly. Yeah, courtly. Mm-hmm. He was courtly. He did everything but, swirl his hand and bow and said, I'm Jelly Roll Morton at your service. Just at the door. She's holding the door for him. And then he goes to Alan and says, I'm here to set the story straight. Everybody's stealing my stuff, and so forth. Here is Alan from the BBC. This is at least something you won't find anywhere else. The Art of the Negro, Mr. Jelly Roll from New Orleans, 1951. He says, as a collector of ballads and folk songs, I'd always felt a certain natural hostility toward jazz. And then one day in the spring of '38, the composer of the tune we just played, which was big, in this case, Black Bottom Stone 2, came walking into the Library of Congress offices and introduced himself as Jelly Roll Morton, originator of jazz and king of stomps and swing, and that's what his business card said. This handsome New Orleans man wore his $100 suit. Lomax was making at that time $650 a year, which was half a day laborer's pay. So much for a good job at LC, right?
Right.
And even in the basement, too. So this suit would have been one-sixth of
Lomax's yearly income. Yeah.
His southern gentleman manners and his diamonds as if he had never heard of the Depression. 10 years before, Jelly Roll had been king of the hot musicians, prosperous enough to put diamonds in his own sock supporters. I don't know whether he's being figurative here or not, and to wear one in his front tooth. And there it flashed in the middle of the band leader's smile. Now he was playing for coffee and cakes in Washington, where the shows seemed come to die. There's a mean line. And he had decided to carve a niche in history by telling a story to the library. For my part, I wanted to see how much folk song there was in this mind of an old-time jazz guy, and I set up my recording machine near the piano in the austere chamber music auditorium. That's the Hoover, I guess. I set the needle spinning on the acetate and soon began a new way of writing history. You'll hear it now at this beginning. It gives a sample in the program of that and says this may be the first life history of a musician done in the United States, and you're probably right about that. Here was an American Negro as proud of his ancestry. He was a New Orleans Creole, a people who, long before 1880, had their own newspapers, literary societies, who after the Civil War took over the government of Louisiana and passed the Universal Suffrage Bill, who named their son Ferdinand after the useless king of Spain. It was really the Queen Isabella who did something. I know, he's putting this on BBC. I don't know. When I was 6 months old, my godmother borrowed me, this is him talking, and took me around the saloons, setting me on the bar for everybody to admire. Then through some kind of fracas, she got arrested and sent to jail, and so was I. And he said, the inmates were singing and making a lot of noise, and it was there that I got my first musical inspiration. And he goes on about this, but that's nowhere else quoted in that bar.
That's great stuff, and yeah, Lomax is always embellishing with sort of literary flourishes, so that's some fun writing there. So those sessions took place in the Coolidge Auditorium across the street in the Jefferson Building, and in certain ways they changed the face of music history, and in certain ways they changed the face of ethnography, if you know what I mean, because you just mentioned that they are probably the first life history / oral history of a musician certainly in America.
And certainly,
so what was Lomax's influence there?
Well, I haven't looked for this, but I don't know of any kind of recorded autobiography or whatever by anybody at that point. And kings, princes,
right?
Yeah,
I mean, we think it's the first extended oral history. But it's certainly the first extended oral history
which
of a
musician. Which he got as a model, he said, from the Russians who were recording their bards. Right. And if I can believe Shostakovich, then Stalin started killing the bards because the history they maintained was one they wanted to get rid of. And so those efforts were amazing if he's right.
Right.
So Morton is very aware that I'll just keep talking, And if you listen to the recordings, he's what do I want to say? He's changing the mood as the stories change. So there's a lynching occurs. And there's lynching, I think, it involved Italians and African Americans in New Orleans. And he subtly goes into a minor key and then stays there a while and pulls slowly out of it into a change of subject. The subject was a guy, I can't think his name, who shot 12 cops because one of them knocked his snow white Stetson hat into a mud puddle.
Sounds like Stagger Lee, right?
Yeah, that's and
Robert Charles.
All he needed was a blue steel 45, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever it was. So he thought, I'm worthy of this stuff. But this is what's strange to me. I found this little note that said that this was from Washington Daily News again. Jelly Roll charts jazz, Dean of Gates. That was a hip term at the time. Hey, Gate. Runs U Street nightclub now, and the years encroach, but his fingers know the ivories of yore. Whoa, there's a line. I'm going to dance off both my shoes when they play those Jelly Roll blues. He's got a little quote there from. So he's talking to Jelly Roll, and Jelly Roll says, I'm going to be recording at the Library of Congress. And, you know, you wonder, people saying, come on, man, it's not going to be recording.
Yeah.
They don't make records, you know, and why you?
Right.
And so they ask him, what's he going to record? And he says, flee as a bird to the mountains, a funeral march much inclined to the south, 2 drum beat effects, one going to the cemetery, the other returning. The tempo of the drums in the latter instance is faster, but not speedy. The composer quickened the beat to hasten the bereaved. He goes on and on about that. And the other will be the Black Diamond Express to Hell. This is a preacher's thing about, this is a moral lesson. Did he really sit there and say, I'm going to do it? Because he didn't do it.
Right, those recordings are not in.
Is he putting them on?
Right. Was that a joke or? Yeah.
I don't know. Would you want to listen to this? I mean, I guess.
So that line was great. His fingers know the ivories of yore, and it makes me think of looking at an old piano and thinking, you know, those ivories know the fingers of yore is the way I would think of it. But it just amazing writing, and also just revealing about what he was planning on doing versus what he actually did, or what he claimed he was planning on doing. But again, it's all this presentation of self question. What is genuine and what is kind of put on or made up, and it's a little bit hard to tell with Jelly Roll. Another thing that you've talked about is how, you know, he was seen as kind of corny at that time, and one of the things that's interesting to me, you played particularly New Orleans Joys. Not that long ago, we had Billy Bragg here at the library, and he was talking about the history of skiffle. And, you know, skiffle emerged out of the trad jazz scene, which were young British people in the 1950s emulating New Orleans African Americans of the 1920s and playing this New Orleans jazz type of music. And skiffle emerged out of that scene. So all the early skiffle players like Lonnie Donegan, who essentially created the spark that created British rock and roll, played in a band that played that stuff. So skiffle was part of that scene, but also a reaction against it. It was what happened when guys who played that music started to think of it as corny.
Lomax also had a skiffle band.
Yeah, and Lomax had a skiffle band. So it's like the corniness propels a certain amount of innovation that creates the next thing. But without this love of New Orleans jazz, I think you know, skiffle wouldn't have happened, and British rock might not have happened. And the reason I thought of that is just that, you know, the Ken Collier skiffle group out of which Lonnie Donegan came, one of their albums was called New Orleans Joys, and just based on that Jelly Roll recording. So,
it's interesting that before Lonnie Donegan's recordings, they were about 54 or something like that.
Yeah, 54.
The first British records to get on the hit list, I believe, was, what do I want to say about this? That, let me be sure I'm right. They were stealing the stuff from Lomax's collection and were putting it out themselves. And it gets into a complicated story. The thing important to remember here is that folk songs were worthless before this.
Yeah.
I mean, worth something to people, but not to anyone else. You just couldn't sell it.
Economically worthless, yeah.
They were faux folk songs, you know,
Yeah.
like cowboy movies and the like. But
they hadn't been monetized, as we say now.
Right. So you couldn't sell the stuff. I mean, they were, of course, the things sold in the neighborhoods, but they weren't. There was no money on that. And so this was actually beginning to make money in a big sort of way. And the Weavers made a lot of money out of Goodnight Irene, but also out of things like Israeli army songs.
Right.
You know, it was incredible. I want to say one more thing that I didn't know about till fairly recently. I wondered why in Britain, late in the game, these skiffle bands, and then after the skiffle bands, sort of more elaborate ones like New Orleans replica bands, why they were so big in the anti-nuclear movement.
Yeah.
They were always there at the front. You can see them in the newsreels. And I found out it's because they thought this was people's music. They put this is the music of people who haven't been filtered through the system and so on. Well, I think the same thing was going on with people, like I've been talking about going to that club. This was music that was new to them. It was alien. It was like coming from Mars. And it was done by real people. It wasn't done by people who were having hits and the like of it. So there was this kind of, you didn't have to be a leftist. You just had to be someone who respected the originality coming from this kind of, it's like, one of the New Yorker writers, Whitney Balliet, said of Ornette Coleman once. He said he came into New York disguised as a country boy. He was a complete genius who came to New York disguised as a country boy. Well, he was what he was. He never changed that, but it's the way they viewed him. They said, oh, like his dress, his hair's too long, the shoes are brogans. I don't know.
There's the assumption that the genius can't be a country boy, that if he's a genius, then the country boy thing must be a disguise. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. So,
we would now say he was an organic intellectual.
Right. There's a lot of ways to describe it, yeah. So. Well,
the ending is it's not good. He got in an argument over music in the kitchen, and someone stabbed him in the back of the neck, and it was misdiagnosed as asthma and so forth when he died. He was still functioning, but in a weak sort of way, and Lomax hooked him up with some people who made actually some of his best records with a lot of singing in them. They're now available under some other name. It was originally called
Commodore, right?
I can't remember what the title of it. They're really good. They have songs that are in groups' books or even in films. People often don't quite understand them. One of them is Winin' Boy, Wine, W-I-N-I-N, apostrophe. That's hip winding, and you find that from West Indians who refer to whining and so forth. Right. So they treat it as either, in one film, Crossroads, it's called The Winning Boy. And the other one I'm thinking of, it's a person who's whining all the time. So they don't quite understand what they're. Graduate students with not enough. Right. They went off to Hollywood. Right. So it's a sad ending. He tried various things. He went to California, and his wife actually did very well. She started a chicken place in Malibu. Not the Malibu we know, but, the area. And it made the Duncan Hines, I think. It was like this. Yeah, it made the Duncan Hines list as one of the best restaurants in America. My little comment on that is one night I was driving down from, oh, God, what is that creepy place up in the hills above there? David Lynch loves it. Mulholland Drive, yeah. Right. And a storm came, a really bad storm, and I was coming down the mountain, and I didn't realize this was a dirt road, and it had a curve every car length, so you could barely get through, and the roads were getting slippery, and I was panicked. I couldn't see, and the lights weren't good, and they were always going the wrong. I get to the bottom, and I'd driven to the back of Jelly Roll's wife's restaurant.
Amazing.
While I was working, there's somebody being taken, something. So it's not a good ending, and we don't have time to show. I have a film. Really, that's the kind of travesty that one expects, but it's the Legend of 1900, an Italian cult film, which is very big in Italy and bombed out here, done by the guy who did Cinema Paradiso, and it's done in English with Italian actors. They had to dub in things, except for Tim Roth, who plays a piano player who has never left this huge this tourist boat, this Titanic-type boat, because his parents abandoned him there, and the people down in the hold protected him, kept him away from the authorities, and he grew up there, and he never left the boat.
Raised on a cruise ship.
So he plays the piano, and so on. And Jelly Roll Morton shows up at one day. It's Clarence Williams III, and he's the exact opposite of him. He's like a scary mafia guy. So and he plays and embarrasses Tim Roth, and then keeps getting more embarrassing as he plays, and Roth can't keep up with it. But the magic of Italian Hollywood, whatever, Citizen is that what's called it? He beats him by growing 2 extra arms, so he plays 4-handed. Now, you can find this in many versions of things like the film Crossroads, where they didn't have the nerve to have a white guy play against a black guy. This had to do with New Orleans and with the Crossroads and Robert Johnson and selling your soul to the devil. So in that film, Ralph Macchio? Ralph Macchio wins over Steve Vai, very unlikely winning there, by playing a Villalobos piece instead of a blues. Right. Now, if that's not saying the white man's always on top, I don't know what is. But the sad story is that all the films that have ever dealt with jazz, except for one, always have a story like that. The Birth of the Blues, A Song is Born. It's the best of all, King of Jazz with Paul Whiteman, early sound film. They have a giant melting pot, and everyone in the world gets into this pot to make jazz, including Aleuts, Alpine hornblowers, Fiji people, everybody but African Americans get into the pot, and out comes jazz. The one film that doesn't do this, I don't urge you to see, but it's nice. It's the Young Indiana Jones, and it used to be an afternoon show, right? It's not bad. You should see him meet Krishnamurti or Annie Besant or Einstein. Or he punches out John Ford, punches out Hemingway.
Right.
Anyway, in this one, he's in prep school in New England, Boston, and the young Sidney Bechet, about 19 years old, has brought his band up from New Orleans to play for the prep school bands. So young Indiana's friend just taunted him, you got to go play. You play the C melody saxophone. So he plays with him. He's really awful. And the band starts playing, instead of this New Orleans sort of what you've been hearing, it goes into the two sort of 1 and 2 and 1 and 2. And they're rolling their eyes. And he's into it, he's going. And so are all the kids. But he senses something wrong. It's in the midway through, and then gets really depressed and quits. And then Bechet comes up to him and puts his arm around him and says, "It's not your fault, kid." He said, "You just grew up in the wrong place with the wrong people."
Right. No, a funny corollary to that is, we're talking about films with the black and white musicians. Back to the Future, where Chuck Berry gets the idea for rock and roll from this kid from the future who's white, but who only has the idea for rock and roll because of Chuck Berry, in the future. So they turn it into a racial paradox there, which is kind of interesting too.
I thought you were going to bring up Ida Red by the Western song that's the basis. That's a shocker to find out that Chuck Berry used to play Western swing.
That's right, yeah.
But with a totally different feel to it. And by the way, I found on the web the other day a picture of Howard students square dancing in 1949.
Interesting.
This country is more complicated than...
it's complicated. I think we might have to leave it at how complicated the country is. But thank you so much for your new material, and we'll look forward to seeing what you find out during your stay at the library.
Thank the libraries. The library is my big monument, my big statue that nobody's going to tear down, I hope. And thank the Logan Foundation for creating possibility to be here. And thank you for coming. I don't take it lightly. Thank you.
The manuscripts. Just Steve, you want to just field a couple here?
Yeah, and actually, you had said I should mention a little bit about the crate. That crate is the wooden crate on the end is just there because during the war they switched from using aluminum for the basis of acetate discs to using glass because aluminum was being used in the war effort, and so glass discs were very fragile. And because of that, they had a workaround to transport any of them. They would make these wooden crates. So now the Jelly Roll recordings, of course, were made before the war, but these were duplicates, and it says clearly on the box, Jelly Roll Morton duplicates. So that's the reason for the crate. But yeah, any questions? Yeah.
Hello. Is this here? Can you hear me? I heard that at the end of his life, when Jelly Roll Morton was dying, no one came to visit him in the hospital except one musician from New Orleans, and that he was shunned. And I wonder if you have heard anything. Is it if you know anything about that, or if this is an indication that he was really unpopular and considered obnoxious as or what it is.
I'm only getting part of it. Just saying, I should say I'm getting old, but I lost my hearing being a musician much earlier. So now I'm an old musician who lost his hearing earlier.
So the question was whether you'd heard anything about Jelly Roll's last days in the hospital. Apparently, he was only visited by one older musician from New Orleans, and everybody else shunned him. And whether that.
Well, it was also said that he couldn't get into a white hospital. I didn't find the material I'd need. That's not the easiest stuff to find. And one thing is true. Because somebody visited him, that somebody had put a fan on him. And this led people to say he had asthma and died of asthma. But a Washington doctor published a little piece about this and said that it was likely because they had no air conditioning in the hospital. He knew the hospital, and this was actually an act of mercy. And he didn't die of asthma; he died of heart failure and so forth. So, well, Billie Holiday had almost no visitors, which I'm amazed to see that a guy who sells more books than I'll ever sell, who's written about Frank Sinatra, makes up a whole scenario where Frank Sinatra not only visits her every day, but feels guilty for not doing this or that. And you know, that's a better ending than just saying nobody came. But is it surprising that nobody shows up when a great person's dying? They don't want to be in on that scene. And,
I guess that's right, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, you mentioned that there was a collection of dialects with Alistair Cooke's first recording
Yes.
as part of it. Can you tell me more about where that is and how I can get a hold of it?
Well, there are a couple of different such collections. One of them is online at the library's website, so you can go and search for those recordings. The American Dialect Society collection itself is not entirely online, but you can access it in the Folklife reading room, which is across the street in the Jefferson building. So if you just search on the library's website for dialect recordings, you'll find a lot of the collection that is online, but the stuff that's not, you can come and visit us and we can play for you in the reading room. And Alistair Cooke is in the portion that's not online, unfortunately. But other questions? One more.
Could you tell us a little bit more about exactly how Lomax got permission to make these special recordings?
I could use his words. Well, I can't paraphrase him. It was Harold Spivak. Yeah. He said...
So Harold Spivak was the head of the music division of the library at the time.
And Spivak actually did recordings in prisons at one point to see what it was like. And so, the first thing he said, the recordings, the discs were expensive. And he needed about 100, he said, to do this. And they, of course, would never have heard of him. And he said he got very excited when you read what I was looking for, but can't find quickly. He said it was his voice and the way he spoke. He said it was a different kind of English. It was a kind of classical style of his own. It was rhetorically interesting, exciting. And I think that's what really got him to think maybe I should record this guy, because he really didn't think there was, this jazz guy knew that much. And that's why he starts by asking him about a folk song, which he proceeds to do. But you'll see pieces of music over there by, from Il Trovatore and so on. He knew classical music, he knew all kinds of things, church music and the rest of it. So he said, I ran upstairs and said, quick, I got to have 100 records. And there's a guy downstairs. Oh, why they did that, I have no idea. He was a guy who's only been there a short time, and he's, 21 or 2?
Right.
And he's making $650 a year, and...
Yeah, he's like, 22 or 23 in 1938.
And he looks like a
I guess,
bum.
yeah.
I mean, that's what the FBI files said. They said the man is disreputable and he hangs out with Negroes. And hey, they followed him his whole life for that.
They did. I mean, his whole life he was harassed.
They kept repeating that over and over
yeah.
again. Hangs out with Negroes, likes folk music. Oh, well. So I don't know why they did it. They trusted him on this. And then he said, I grabbed a bottle of liquor and they started drinking. But Lomax sat down, got him to the piano, a really fine piano, and used this his field recording stuff, and he sat at his feet. And said, managed to sit so he could change the stuff without looking, he was still holding his eyes. So he treated himself as an audience, and that was apparently one of his strategies. If I can get him to be talking to me, I can make this work. And it just went on and on and on. And it moved into places that no one could imagine they'd move into topics, to everything from poverty to hurricanes to the invention of this and that. And
yeah.
Would anybody even today say to somebody, "I want to give me 100 records"? What would it be today? The equivalent of this. Well, it would be digital, but they'd still want to know more than this guy just wandered in and said, "I want to record."
Right. Yeah, and amazing stuff about. I mean, if you're interested in New Orleans at all, amazing stuff about the history of New Orleans is in there. Amazing stuff about other jazz musicians. Buddy Bolden, who was mentioned before, is talked about a lot by Jelly Roll. So yeah, a lot of what we know about that New Orleans scene is in those recordings. So you have homework. You have to watch The Legend of 1900. You have to listen to the Jelly Roll box set if you can, and you have to watch Young Indiana Jones.
I have one last thing to say. One last thing. Talking about how he talked, he had real grace and care about what he said, despite people saying he was a braggart and what have you. So at one point, he's cautiously approaching the fact that's still not known by almost anybody, but that most of the piano players in jazz were women. And then Annette Handy's, that's the first name, Annette Handy's book on Southern orchestras, none of them were men up to a certain point. Right. In Birmingham, an area I know well, there were only 2 men piano players before 1945. Women in the New York Union sued over the fact that they were being pushed out by men at one point, and then became actors because they joined the Actors Union because it was better paid, but they were still playing pianos. At any rate, at one point, Jelly's trying to say why he was spirited by going to the opera and seeing the opera musicians because they had long hair. And he said, I had heard about long hair music, but these guys really had long hair. And he somehow talks about Tony Jackson, the one player he thought was better than he, and he greatly admired. And Tony Jackson was known to be gay, not because Morton said so, he just was known. And Lomax knew this. So Lomax says to him, Tony, was he a fairy? And there's a pause, and he says, I don't know, he might have been a tugboat.
There you go.
There you go, indeed.
On that note, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.